to Motivation U, the podcast. Hello, welcome to Motivation U, the podcast, coming to you live from Spurrier's Gridiron Grill inside the Coach's Podcast Room. Had a nice little experience this morning. I came in early to do this show, and the room was occupied by Pat Dooley and Coach Steve Spurrier. So it was always nice to see the head ball coach here. And we do have a lot of things happening. We're coming up to the Christmas season, and we have some Dale Carnegie classes coming up. I'm not going to give you the entire litany of every class and where it is. Just go to jacksonville.dalecarnegie.com, find a course, and click on it. You can find them in Lake City, Valdosta, Jacksonville, Gainesville, all over. That's jacksonville.dalecarnegie.com. And plus online courses, everything else you want to find there. My guest today, Mitch Glaeser. Welcome, Mitch.
Thank you for having me.
I loved his LinkedIn title as it says serial entrepreneur. Now, of course, I teach communications.
Right.
So when you say the word serial, you don't know how you're spelling that.
Right.
You have no idea how you're spelling it. But he's not selling Wheaties and he's like, he starts businesses.
But how do you know that might not be my next business? Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. True.
New idea.
So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited. We both have a mutual friend that we admire greatly in Freddie Wiebe, and he connected the two of us. And I am so excited to talk to you about leadership and hear about your journey, which is extremely unique, and find out how you got to where you are. So, Mitch, where did the world start for Mitch Glaeser?
So I'd like to equate a lot of the things I do with the influence of a lot of others. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about kind of who I am and how I got here, kind of where that begins goes a lot further back than even before I was born. So, a lot of influences come from those around you, right, when you come into the world. And candidly, there are also moments in time that make an important impression upon kind of who you are and ultimately what you become. And how you take those moments of opportunity, as I'll call them. Sometimes they're adverse in nature, and so you have important decision points to make about the integrity of who you're going to be, the morality of who you're going to be, what kinds of people you're going to surround yourself with. I think plays a very, very big role in exactly who you are, mm-hmm. right? And it's not necessarily guilt by association, not the negative characteristic, because you might also be trying to change somebody else's life, right? So if you have something to offer in the world, it's not necessarily a bad thing to play a role in other people's lives as well.
Always.
Through leadership as well. So those characteristics and all those moving pieces I just talked about really collectively not only make myself, but what I think really makes every individual themselves. Because we all have decision points, and we make those decisions based on characteristics that we're faced with throughout our life. And so a lot of that comes very, very early, and some even later. I mean, we're constantly growing, right? I mean, that's what Dale Carnegie.
Now, in the Dale Carnegie world, we refer to that as the defining moment.
Sure.
You know, our lives are nothing but a mosaic of small little pieces that make up our life.
Yeah.
And we talk about those defining moments.
Right.
And living an intentional life. That's the other part of it, where where you're not pushing the rope, you're
Yeah.
pulling the rope.
Right.
You know?
I coined a phrase called life is a bundle of priorities. So we're here today because we have tons of other things that we could be doing. We could be, fishing or playing golf or working in a different arena or whatever. But those are also characteristics, right? Those things that you prioritize within your life, and how those kind of transform who you are as well. But back to your question, I think a lot of it really goes back to the fact that my grandfather, who I was named after, Mitchell Emory, and came to Florida in 1923. That's where Emory Group companies actually originated from. Next year will be 100 years old,
Wow.
actually.
Awesome.
Moved to Zephyr Hills, Florida, but he died when my mother, I believe, was 8 years old. And those influences, he was a post commander for American Legion, World War I vet. He was an elected official. He was a school board member, and in South Florida, Central Florida. He was very entrepreneurial. He was big into education. He actually taught teachers. He was a CPA by education. So he had this amazing amount of transformed influences on so many people. And when he passed away, that actually, my grandmother, believe it or not, raised 6 young girls by herself. And, really built that kind of leadership structure around the woman of my grandmother. You think about that, how impactful that must have been for a woman back in that day to raise 6 young girls.
What years are we talking about here?
So they came in 1923, and my mother was born in 36, so he died in the 40s.
So early 40s. So
Yeah.
the things going on, I mean, we had World War II happening and just coming out of the Depression
Yeah.
and so
Correct.
many different things that those individuals at that time. And then, throw on having to raise 6 daughters by
Right.
herself. So
Yeah.
that's
One of the most incredible stories I think I ever heard that really made a lot of sense to me about the impact of individuals was a story where so he was a CPA by education, but he actually ran a farm. And the farm was an egg farm, was a poultry farm.
Okay.
So they literally just had eggs, and they sold the eggs. And my mother, as a very, very young child, probably 5 or 6 years old at the time, literally asked my grandfather, said, "Well, Daddy, how much money do we make on each egg?" And he said, "Oh, about as much as a grain of sand." And she said, "Well, that's not very much." And he took her by the hand, and he saw it as a teachable moment, right? And so he took her over to the house where they, were in, really clustered together. She was with her other sisters, and she was the youngest. And he went to the edge, the corner of the house, and he picked up a handful of sand. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but he picked up a handful of sand, and he said, "What do you see there?" And she said, "A bunch of sand." He goes, "Those are grains of sand." He goes, "That sand collectively is what the foundation of this house sits on." And he goes, "Each one of those little teeny tiny pieces of sand play an important role in life, because working together, it creates a foundation. You love living in this house, right?" And her line was, "Yes, except I don't like living in the same bedroom as my other sisters." But
could be bigger, Dad.
but he talked in more of a more profound sense. He said, "Do you know that the beaches are made up of little teeny tiny pieces of sand, and they work together to hold back the forces of the biggest oceans?" And if you think about the storms that come in and what really protects the coastlines of the world, not necessarily, even beyond Florida and the U.S., it's those little pieces of sand. And he said, you have to go through life and understand that everyone plays an important role, no matter how big or small they are. And for me, that's where I collectively find myself when I start a company or have started companies in the past, to recognize that everyone is playing an important role, no matter how big or small they are, to hold back the forces of whatever we're faced with, right? And so that's where leadership, in my opinion, really starts to shine. And collectively bringing those organizations together to understand. I actually had an interview with one of the top McDonald franchise owners, and he stated to me, this wasn't that long ago, he says, you realize if like 6 people don't show up at 5 o'clock in the morning, there is no McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's those little pieces that are the
That make that happen.
that make it happen.
Yep.
So anyways, that's, a little bit about one fun story.
So you grew up in Gainesville.
I did.
Okay.
Yep.
And you had mentioned to me that you were one of 81 kids.
Right. So
Talk to me about that.
So I was raised in a foster family. My kind of fast forward. So my dad was stationed at MacDill Air Force Base during Korean War, and served 8 years in the Air Force. Met my mother. She was born and raised in Zephyr Hills, Florida, and they packed up, got married, packed up, moved to Gainesville to go to college in 1955, and in a 28-foot long mobile home, if you can imagine. And 36 months later, 3 years later, they were a family of 5. So my mother had 3 children, boom, 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 right, about a year apart. And they were, now my father had to drop out of college and raise a family, and it kind of transformed the mission of getting a college degree, which my father came back in his 60s and actually finished his degree and taught computer sciences till he retired on his second go round. So they came here when the third child was born. My brother Greg, there were some medical complications with that. I mean, he's fine and everything, but the doctor said you've got to take a pause. It's too much wear. And so 5 years later, I came along, and unfortunately, my mother couldn't have any more children after me. And so they immediately said, you know what, that's fine. We want a large family. We'll just start taking in foster children. So there's 76 foster children who followed over the next 30 years, and then one adopted girl, Teresa. So there's 4 biological children, which I'm the youngest, born to my parents, one adopted, Teresa, and 76 foster children.
So your parents were foster children to 70.
Yes, to 76. They actually started the State of Florida Foster Parent Association. They helped create that with a number of other people. So those are also characteristics that I learned from. They started the Foster Parent Association in Alachua County. So they were very, very early. They were the first certified foster parents in the state of Florida for special needs children. They really have a very rich history and very uncelebrated. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's not why they do it or did it, and there's no need to even to reconcile that. That's not the issue at all. They did it out of passion and love, and that's all that really matters. But the fact of the matter is they were pioneers. And when people look at me and they go, my gosh, you've done all these things and you're involved in all these things and you've led this, these organizations and drives and companies, and you're doing all this, amazing work. It really, like I started out with this, discussion, it really is a collective path that has been that I saw through my own eyes. Mm-hmm. So it becomes second nature at that point.
Something that the way you say it, and something that you said is, I grew up in a foster home. People's mind, again, the mind works in pictures.
Right.
So as we generate words, really people are grasping those in visuals. So as you say that, my mind is you were a part of a foster home where your parents gave you to this foster home. The visual that you paint is, until the very end, is that these people were coming to your home, So, yeah, I think it's really important. One of the, and there are, foster families are I wouldn't say, I don't want to use the word run. That's grossly inappropriate use of word. They are, I'll show you how created. I'll just share I will tell you it was a very simple structure. Mm-hmm. It did not matter if you were biological or foster. You were treated exactly the same. Which I see that. I see that just in our conversation, that's the way that was.
The oldest child got the front seat. that was just
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter.
It didn't matter where they were from.
No,
you know.
it was just the oldest gets the first. It's a whole pecking order based on age. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And then it became, there was a chore list, and it just rotated, and everybody was plugged in.
Mitch, you talk a lot about leadership. What were the early foundations of your leadership thought process?
So, I call them turning points. I think you had a different term earlier, and it's already escaped me, unfortunately. But so those defining moments, right, are really what got me to have that real introspective look. When you get to our age, you really do recognize you can pretty much look at a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, and you're going to see somewhat of a pattern of the kinds of person they're going to be in terms of a leadership role and those kinds of things. So, having said that, I think there's two things that happen in people's lives and what I call those turning points. So when you sit a person down, no matter how old they are, they're probably going to have 3 to 5 defining moments that they'll look back and say, wow, that was so super impactful, right? It might have been from a grandparent, it might have been from a teacher, it might have been with a neighbor, it might have been with an experience my brother uses. So it's either a positive experience, or it's one where you recognize that it may have, I wouldn't even call it adverse. I'm going to give you some examples. But they come in really 2 different lanes, okay? My brother uses the example of a fighter jet, a Top Gun fighter went out, was in his first day of training kind of thing, went out and came back and had thrown up all over the cockpit. Just literally, this is early days. And came back and it was a mess over the instruments and everything. Long story short, he was mortified. He was just like, oh, this is going to be horrible. Multi-million-dollar, trainer and so forth. Came back, the guy opened the cockpit, the other service member was there, and he says, I am so, so sorry. And he said, I've seen worse. And that he became one of the top fighter pilots in America's history. And it was because of that defining moment of how that situation handled. Yep. He knew that he could go on.
Make the fault seem easy to correct.
Exactly,
yep.
Right?
Right.
Never threw up again, went on to greatness. And he uses
or
that
that
story.
Individual could have said, oh, you're terrible. You're never going to make this.
Bingo. Right. Exactly. Think of that moment of how he could have just really had a difference of that outcome.
And we don't realize. And one of the things through my teachings that I see individuals, we don't realize the impact we have on other people. No matter if we're not a leader, if we don't look upon ourselves as a leader, we still make impacts on other people every day, either with a smile or a kind word or holding a door.
Right.
Amazing.
Yeah. The other is, so that's, you can be inspired by moments like that, and where, and that wasn't so much an inspiration, but you can have, a band leader or a teacher or somebody really, really support you and really help you excel and show you those fine tunings to be that much better. For me, I had an interesting experience, and we somewhat debate this in the family because it's kind of a funny moment, because I had the opposite effect. When I was in middle school, the space program had consumed America. And the shuttle program and being an astronaut and going to the moon, and it had gotten to, so going to the moon, I think we landed on the moon when I was like 5 years old. And so then follow that up through middle school, right? So the next 7 to 10 years, the focus was you need to go to school, you need to do your work, and you need to become an astronaut, because the best people become astronauts. It's just what it was at the time.
Amen.
And I remember going...
Live that.
We all... So I remember going to middle school, and I remember it like it was yesterday. It's a complete defining moment for me. I remember going in, and I wasn't a below average student at all, but I remember going in and sitting at the table, and the test scores came back and everything, and all the folks around me did better on their scores, did better on their tests. had a higher IQ. We'll just put out the facts, right? And I remember going home with the absolute recognition that I was never going to be an astronaut. You can imagine like how that would be so internal to a middle schooler, right? To say, wow, I just recognized for the first time, hey, little Mitch, you're not going to the moon.
You just got a kick in the pants.
And so I took that opportunity to recognize that I was not going to be the smartest guy in the room unless I surround myself with smarter people, unless I hustle, unless I outpace, outwork, have show more integrity in the way I do business, you know, and really inspire others to achieve at their highest possible levels, right? And so, you know, that to me was an opportunity for me to redesign who I could really be, right? And how I could possibly be part of somebody else going to the moon. And that's just as important, and possibly more important. And so, you know, there are those characteristics that kind of happen. I remember we had. Do we have more time?
No.
Good.
Yeah, well,
So
fine.
I remember another kind of interesting story is that so we had triplet sisters. I have triplet sisters straight from the hospital, foster sisters, and identical. And it's so funny because we labeled their feet A1, B2, and C3 because they're identical, right? And we had to kind of keep them straight. And so what's interesting about that is that they were, think about it, same egg, right? One sperm, collide, and that egg split 3 times. So they have the same DNA, right? So should they go into society and be the same exact people? You know, does one of them become a leader and the others don't, or all 3 become leaders? And so that's where you recognize that those impactful moments really help shape their mind in terms of how they're going to be. I can promise you they're all 3 different. If you get them in a room, one of them's going to be the leader of the pack, right? And so what's very interesting is they're identical in every way except for one. Their fingerprints are all different. And so when I look at creating, you know, organizations or companies, or you recognize that every family has its own fingerprint. Every individual has its own fingerprint. You could take Spurrier's restaurant, you could take this exact restaurant and place it somewhere else. You could place it in Orlando, Florida. And just because the personnel that works within it, it would have its own fingerprint.
Yes, it definitely would.
You could have the same food, but it would still have a whole different outcome.
One of the defining moments in my life, one of the many, was a conversation the day of my dad's funeral that I had with my oldest sister, who has passed away now. And we were sitting there, and she said, you know, something you don't realize. She was like 6 years older than me, had her master's. She worked in child services her whole life, and just a remarkable lady. And she said, you know, one of the things you don't realize is none of us grew up in the same family. I said, like, what do you mean by that? You know, and I'm a fairly educated person thinking, where are you going with this?
Right.
And she said, you were the only boy in the family, and you were the youngest. None of us grew up in that family. Only you. I was the oldest sister. I had 3 sisters. She said, I was the oldest. Nobody else grew up in that family. And when you sit down and really think about that, is our journeys are so much different, just for different reasons. Now it helps you understand a little bit of where other people came from and what was going on in their life. But that is so true of what you're saying right now.
Absolutely. So my mother sewed my clothes until I was in the 7th grade, which me and my brother Christopher were 7 years older than me, right? So I was 12, we'll call it, in 7th grade. And so he was 19 years old. So to what you just said, he grew up in a family of extremely humble beginnings. Whereas I got the journey of seeing my parents come into middle class.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it was a
Different family.
very different family.
Different family.
You're absolutely spot on.
And it was, that 2012. I wish I would have heard that probably in
Right.
1972.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It would have been nice to hear those words and to try to understand a little bit.
Christopher had 7 years without foster children, right? So it was just the four of them, the four kids, for us, and less than that for part of his journey, because he was the oldest and they were coming along. Very, very true.
The thing about your oldest, your sister is the oldest?
No, Teresa's the youngest.
Okay, so you have a brother that is the oldest.
I have a brother that's 7 years older, then 6 years older, then 5 years older, and then I'm 7 years older than Teresa.
And for a year, even though he might not remember it, he was the only child.
Of course, right.
So there was that parental doting on the only child, I'm
going to remind him of that later on today.
But that's a big part of it. If they say that our personalities are created in the first 4 or 5 years of our life,
right.
That first year is very important,
Sure.
how you're treated.
Yeah.
And, then you come along 7 years later, it's much different.
Right,
And,
for sure.
And when a mother and a father understand that this is your last child, they're going to treat that person differently also.
Right.
Like this is the last time we're going to go through the process of having babies.
Right.
Right. So it's a remarkable thing to think about.
I think another thing that is super important for individuals to recognize for their own personal development and growth is being able to focus on moments of impact. And so I've been on probably about 25, I would have to dive deep to really remember every organization I've been on their board of directors, but about 25, and I've been president of about 20 of them. And I think when I talk to, and I have a couple mentorship groups that I run, and I talk to them about finding those moments, those heartfelt passions, and then being impactful within those organizations that help those. And to me, that has also helped foster who I am. I know back to my grandfather, he was very involved in the community. Like I said, he was a school board member and those kinds of things. And I feel like there's a lot gained when you're put into those, having to work with others. A lot of times working with volunteer boards sometimes is a real true test of your abilities, because it's one thing if you're getting paid to say, okay, I'm the boss, and if you want your paycheck next week, then you've got to fall into line. That's a whole different kind of set of management skills and outcomes. But I think for personal development for individuals, I think it's real important for them to become involved in some form of charitable giving, civically or charity, driven or whatever. And so those kinds of aspects are more critical to individual successes than they recognize.
And those boards are difficult.
Very difficult.
I haven't served on a board for a couple of years now, a number of years. But I did so when I was younger, many of them kind of like you.
Right.
I mean, being in the radio business, everybody wanted the
Sure.
radio station owner, general manager on the board of directors for whatever reason. And you walk in there with your own, you have certain strengths that have elevated you to where you are.
Right.
Thought processes, work ethic, everything else. And then you walk into a room where there's 10 or 12 other people exactly like you, with their same attitude, opinions, and everything.
Yeah.
It's an interesting process to work on those. People look at it.
Well, I think, so to your point, when you look at like the G7, which is the world leaders,
yes.
So we'll take it even to a whole different level, right? So these people have been elevated in their country to be the single individual to represent them. When they get in a room, one of them is going to lead the organization.
Yeah. Who is the alpha? And I won't use the word male because thankfully in today's society, we have recognized that women can be the alpha.
Yeah.
And so who is the alpha in that world, And there's going to be clashes.
Right.
I would love to just be a fly on the wall in one of those G7 meetings for the first 45 minutes.
Sure, to see them navigate, their moment of time to say, hey, this is the policy I think we should go with, kind of thing. But to your point, I think that's very true. I will a fascinating aspect of kind of the characteristics I'm talking about is my oldest brother, Christopher, self-employed, has a company of his own. Mark is self-employed. Greg has, they all have companies. Greg, myself, and then Teresa as well. So you have, it's hard to keep track of the foster kids because a lot of foster brothers and sisters, just because some of them have, gone their own ways. Some of them stay very engaged and close. But we've never come across a full family that every single person is running a company.
Let's talk about that when we come back after break.
Sounds great.
Because I would like to dig into that with you about how that evolution happened, and we'll get into that. We're coming to you live from Spurrier's Gridiron Grill. He's Mitch Glaeser. I'm Bob Ganzak. This is Motivation U, the podcast.
We still hear it. The sound of victory. The joy of being part of something great. And while things may not be the same right now, we haven't gone anywhere. If you bleed orange and blue, then Meldon Law is the firm for you.
Looking for more reasons to celebrate? We have them here at Celebration Point. Enjoy some of the newest additions to our already celebratory lineup, like Dave & Buster's, Les Macarons, and Prime and Pearl. There's always a reason to celebrate. Join us anytime for any occasion. Celebration Point, where Gators come to celebrate.
Welcome back to Motivation U, the podcast. My name is Bob Ganzak. We're coming to you live from Spurrier's Gridiron Grill inside the coach's podcast room, which the coach was in this podcast room today. Just about an hour earlier, he was in here. Had a chance to say hello and talk to him outside. Visors, rooftop. Ooh, the food here is absolutely amazing. Celebration Point is just, my daughter graduated from the University of Florida, and she lives in Michigan now, and we were up there with her this past weekend. And my wife said, you've got to get back to Gainesville just to see the changes that have taken place at Celebration Point and the restaurant, and just an incredible thing. So we're so blessed to be able to come here and do this podcast here. We were talking right before break about how many entrepreneurs were in your family, and that usually you don't have that type of somebody always goes to work for the corporate world, right?
Right.
How did you all get involved in that? What was the process? Was it education?
Yeah.
Was it tech school? Was it just starting to work?
Right. So we all know and recognize everyone has a different path. And it is true that we are all self-employed and we all have our companies, and those each one of those journeys was different. I went to college for a couple of years. I literally was in college for education. I said, I need an accounting class. I need speech class. I need, these different. So I went for about a year and
Pick
a half.
and choose.
Pick and choose.
Yep.
Kind of, you were talking about going Dale Carnegie, pick your series that you want. I think that's really important, and we also talked earlier about the continued growth, right? So I'm not a very big reader, but I do believe in that there are certain books you should be reading.
Yes.
It could come in magazine snippets, it can be audio, it can be.
We have a plethora of
all
just
kinds.
the online
Sure.
medium, so many different areas that we can just read articles.
So we constantly have to grow. But I will say that my oldest brother, Christopher, went to the University of Florida and did graduate from there. So he does have a college degree. He graduated first class of computer sciences at the University of Florida in the 70s. And I always jokingly tell people, Gainesville back in the 70s, and even before this, when my father was there in the 50s, was the greatest college town in America. And what they would do back in the day, this is not physically what happened, but it kind of was a undertow. And this is a joke, but I would say they would line up when graduation day, they would line up all the police cars and the sheriff's cars and all the small towns police cars. They would come and line up, and they would take the college graduates to the county line. They said, "You've done your stint in Gainesville. It's time for a new freshman class.
Move on.
You go on into the world and do your greatness." That's completely changed now. And so
they couldn't keep the people in town back then. It's just
And so everybody left. And so Christopher, as an example, had this wonderful idea about measuring the efficiency of compiler technology, which nobody had done before. Ultimately, he did work on for a couple years up in Philadelphia, I believe it was, certainly in Pennsylvania, and worked on the fastest computer in the world. It took like 6 years to build. They started building it faster when during the middle of that one. It's kind of crazy. You have to remember that's back in the 70s, and so
I remember what a computer looked like in the 70s.
Exactly.
Which told me I don't want to go into computer science. It took up 2 whole rooms.
It took rooms. They elevated them about 4 feet off the ground. They put air conditioners around the whole side to keep them cool. It was just completely
fans.
Different. Yeah, right.
We didn't have portable air conditioners.
So he then went on to Silicon Valley, and was. The crazy thing is he went on to be this great involved community person. He had a daughter that went to Princeton, graduated top of the class, went to USC, graduated med school. I think she was second top of the class there. Then went on. She's now a physician in Atlanta, right? And then his other daughter went to Lewis and Clark, did wonderful things, and really, really bright kids. The problem with that is they could have been Gainesville residents the whole time. And so, so that is kind of transitioned. So Gainesville's the best college town in America in the 70s, and in the 80s and 90s, and you come to today, it's still the best college town in America.
It's an amazing place to live.
And it's 50 years from now, Gainesville's still going to be the best college town in
I love
America.
the melting pot of, every one of my classes. I do most of my classes here in Gainesville. And every one of my classes, if I have 20 people in it, there's probably 6 or 7 different languages that are being spoken as primary languages in the room.
Right.
And I know one.
Yeah.
I butcher that most of the time also.
Yeah.
It's an amazing
My other
community.
My other brother, Mark, he, I think he missed like 1 on SAT or something. Super, super bright brother. And he was an alternate to go to West Point and didn't get called up. And he did not go to college till he was 40 years old. Unbelievable. And so he did computer sciences as well. He graduated and now he actually works for Emory Group for us now. And then Greg, believe it or not, moved to California because Christopher was out there, has never gone to college, and has one of the largest roofing companies in the Bay Area. And then myself, as I told you, went for about a year and a half, did not have a degree, but have started 12 companies and run Emory Group, and also took over Glaeser Realty for my father back in 2005, I believe that was. Now he's subsequently passed away. And then Teresa actually went and got a 2-year degree and went to work for Disney. And so she worked for the Disney stores, and she was one of their top turnaround specialists. So she would go into a Disney store working retail, and so she learned really good quality controls, management skills, customer service, things that Disney is very well known for. And now she owns and operates an apparel store here in Gainesville, called Logo Kick. So that's kind of how each journey has just kind of morphed.
I've met your sister on the chamber business before ours.
Yes, sure, Teresa. That's my sister.
That's your sister.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, small world.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is. Logo Kick is something always jumps in my mind because she promotes it so well. She's outgoing. She's, extremely well.
Personable,
Oh my goodness, she can communicate like anybody. And
Yeah.
Steve Cannon always throws it to her to like say goodbye or whatever it is because she's just such a great communicator.
Right.
It's a lot of
So
fun.
that's a little bit of the journey there. And
It's interesting. Like you and my son have a similar background because my son went to UNF for like a year and a half. And I don't know if he even got a credit hour.
right.
And then this December Maxim magazine, he's named as one of the top 10 entrepreneurs in
Wow.
the country. And, you don't have to have that traditional background.
yeah.
I mean, I like the way you said you went almost like a menu. I want to public speaking. I want accounting.
Right.
These are things that I'm going to need in my career.
Right.
So tell me about the Emory Group. You've mentioned that a couple of times. And your grandfather's middle name was Emory.
Yep.
And that's where the name came
Yep.
from. What is the Emory Group? What do they own? What do they do?
So Emory Group is a basket full of family companies.
Okay.
So all the ones I talked about really kind of come under the umbrella of including Logo Kick and Glaeser Realty, and we have a development arm. So we own, I don't know, we're probably going to eclipse in 2023 about 500,000 square feet of commercial space. So we do, we have. I own a Home Depot shopping center here in Gainesville. I own several shopping centers. We also have a project in Warner Robins. So we have projects everywhere from Nebraska all the way down. So I do historic preservation projects. I own a hotel that in 2 years will be 100 years old called the Grand Weaver, north of Kansas City. So there's a lot of different, hospitality, apparel, real estate. So all of these, I believe it's 8 companies, all fall under Emory Group. So I'm the CEO. When my father fell ill a few years ago, I call it the kind of the patriarch, if you will. So I was vice president of business development. So I was developing all of these companies, concepts, driving sales and marketing plans and those kinds of things, looking at different opportunities within sectors. And then when he fell ill, I became the CEO of the Emory Group. And so what that allowed me to do, ironically, is do less. And so I call it veto power. So as we just talked about Teresa, so Teresa has Logo Kick. She runs extremely well, and we collaborate extremely well. And then if I see anything that maybe we shouldn't be doing, I can kind of step in and we'll talk it out, right? So we're both on the same page all the time. So that's Emory Group. Like I said, it really became a lot easier for me because everyone runs their silo, right? So they run their own companies and divisions.
You're more like the conductor now of
Yes.
the orchestra.
Yeah, and
everybody's playing their instrument, but you're
Right.
helping them put it all together.
In a very, very extremely subtle way, though. Believe it or not, they run the organizations. So when I say it got easier, it really got a lot easier. It did allow me to focus on a new development called San Velasco Tech City.
I want to talk about that. Yes.
So one is I recognized that with my brother having to move away, who I love and adore, and he just moved back with his wife, which is great. After being away for 40 plus years or whatever it ended up being. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of incredible, innovative and bright minds who are wanting to start companies to actually take some of the products into the marketplace that are bubbling up, especially out of the University of Florida. And so we were recognizing that there was a sector of space that was not available to these young startups, affordable and very flexible. They can morph. In other words, depending on their rapid growth, right, or stagnation, or going down maybe. So maybe they have a big space and they need a smaller space. So when you own all of the commercial footprint, if you will, it's very easy to have a lease with someone, and they say, hey, I'm going to come lease from you. And they go, by the way, we now need larger space, so they're going to give that one up and move over here. So I don't really lose a tenant, right? I gain a bigger tenant, as an example. So Rich Glaeser, not to be confused with Mitch Glaeser, but is my business partner.
Okay.
And so he's also in the innovative and entrepreneurial lane. And we recognized that together we could build somewhat of a trophy project that's allowed for us not to have a margin just to get by the banks, to be honest. People say, what's the hardest part of your job? It's getting it past the banks, because they recognize, like, your margins are really thin compared to what we traditionally do on a commercial deal. And so we've built a fully sustainable community. We're building 270,000 square feet of tech space. We're just over 3 years old. We have 47 companies.
Where is this?
It's right on 441, 9 miles north of the campus.
Okay, I've seen it there on the right-hand side.
It is, SFTC.
Because I
Yeah.
usually go back out to 75 that way,
Yeah.
and I see on the right, that's
Yeah,
your
yeah,
project.
Yeah, you have to loop through there. There's a brewery there. We just opened a wine bar. The brewery's opening a little event space there. We have a preschool license for 123 kids. First fully sustainable preschool license in Alachua County, and one of the few in the state of Florida.
Wow.
The entire campus is completely solar fed, so the sun completely operates the whole campus.
Wow.
252 homes are being built. There's, like I said, there's a preschool that we're building a new cafe. Harvest Time just signed a deal with us. We have a new event center. The county's building a new fire station in there. There's a new little kids park, it'll be fire station themed. There's walking trails. There's a biking trail. We're building one with 11 workout stations around a half-mile loop that you can jog and stop at each station. It's going to be like a time thing. And we're, just to kind of give you some examples of how we go into it, we talk about, for instance, we're across the street from 7,200 acre hammock, right, with 30 miles of bike trails. So we're like, that's a central park to our project, right? You can't, if you were in New York City and you lived on the edge of Central Park, it would be magical, right? Because now you're like in with nature, right? This huge, beautiful greenway. So the hammock has 30 miles of bike trails. So we said, okay, when we build the houses, what we need to do is we'll provide a bicycle with every bedroom. So there will be over 600 bicycles on campus.
So you're going to lease these
Oh, yeah.
houses?
In Florida, unfortunately, it's a little perverted. They prohibit you from selling a home in a fully sustainable community. And the way that works is we're going to end up having probably in the neighborhood of, call it 15 million in solar out there. I mean, it's a huge solar package. We have the world's largest bifacial solar array on campus right now. I mean, and we're getting ready to double it the next 3 months. It's super impressive to see. So we, in Florida, if I'm producing this energy on site and I sell you a home and you move into that home and I'm providing the energy to you, that's against the law. It's all territorial. So there's Duke Energy has territories, and that you're their customer if you're in that footprint. GRU, Gainesville Regional Utilities, if you're in that footprint, I cannot provide you energy. There is no energy choice in the state of Florida. And it literally it's crazy when you think about the fact that we're producing it on site. It's not going anywhere. Actually, we overproduce. So we're sending energy out into the grid.
So you do you sell that to the grid to?
We, at nominal amount.
There's I can't think of the name of the company, but there's a company that's north of Lake City that produces their own energy,
Right.
and they sell it to
So you can,
the community.
Sure.
which is-
Yeah. So like Gainesville, if I did a contract with Gainesville, said, "Hey, I'm going to build this solar farm, and you're going to buy this energy." They did that with
The
Greg.
campus,
Right?
I mean, the
Campus,
campus,
same way. Yeah.
We've had a couple of the engineers from the utilities department at the University
Yeah.
of Florida in our classes, so I get to hear those stories. But I mean, you talk about somebody that's creating their own water and everything for the
Sure,
campus.
sure.
It's
So Tech
small
City
city.
is, I call it 1.0. I hope in the next 5 or 10 years, people will
Are you
do
going to
something.
put these other places, or
Not us. What we're trying to do is to inspire that this can be done.
all right?
And we're proving it's a proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing we're doing, for instance, like we have so many different things. Like I'll give you one. We're getting ready to do community gardens, right? So community gardens, you can have these raised beds. And the other thing we do is we do composting, okay? So if I said, hey, we're doing composting, or if somebody said, I compost, that's like checking a box, right? It's like, okay, I compost. Well, what does that
Right.
really mean?
Yeah, what a
So if you have a banana, I have a banana, and you put it in a compost bin, I put it in the garbage can, it still gives off the same amount of methane, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've done nothing. The only thing you're going to be able to do is if you do take your compost and you use it in a garden,
in a creative way. Yes.
in a creative way, then you've made a difference. But just by virtue of composting, you're doing nothing. It's still the same amount of decomposition. So what we found, though, is that what these worm gardens, so you raise a bed, you put, let's say, a garbage can in the middle of the raised bed. You put your compost in there and you drill holes. Then the worms can come and go, right? And the worms break down the banana and not just nature. And so the methane is greatly reduced, right?
I gotcha.
So every time we look at something, we're trying to say, what is beyond that? What is the beyond? So when you can't just check the box, say we're doing this. Yay, we're doing solar. Well, we're doing solar trees out there. So you probably saw the big red solar trees. Many municipalities, including Gainesville, prohibit those because they say all solar must go on a roof or in the back of a building. But Alachua says, hey, we want to celebrate solar. So what we did is through artistic form, we're saying, hey, we're going to do these. We have new design coming out through the residential part. It's
I
really
can remember this community talking about solar back in the 90s.
right.
When I had the radio station here, I would go to meetings and I would hear that.
And there's a lot of solar in Gainesville on rooftops.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but they will not allow you to put it in a like a solar tree or whatever. So what we're trying to do is, what are those beyond? What's it look like? Like I mentioned, the bifacial solar. So we have the largest array of bifacials. So it means when you walk under that promenade, you're looking at a solar panel because it's catching the refractive energy off of Earth's surface.
both sides,
Right?
Yeah.
And then you have the sun side. So we capture about 120 to 130% per square foot. And so it's those kinds of things that really propel it forward.
Mitch, you had mentioned that you're bringing companies into this area. Is it San Flasco Tech
San Francisco Tech City.
Are you giving young entrepreneurs an opportunity to get their business started there?
Of course.
Is that what you're
Yep.
doing? Is it you're attracting those type of individuals?
Of course. So Tech City is very different than like the Hub or the Sid Martin Biotech Incubators and so forth. What we do, when you come out there I embed my office into a museum, and the Museum of Entrepreneurship. When people go, well, what is it? What are you really trying? What's the story behind this, right? So this is really important for people to think about, especially folks who are coming through your programs. When you think about the skill sets to run a business, right? That takes it's a very different skill set than creating a product. So you have innovation, that's the creation of a product or service, okay? And then you have an entrepreneur who's taking the product or service to the marketplace, right? So we talk about Freddie. Is Freddie an inventor or is he an entrepreneur?
Yeah.
Right? He's an entrepreneur.
Yes.
He's taking
He
product.
could be an inventor. He's smart enough to do those things, but he's not.
And when I say invention, I'm talking about inventing the light bulb. I'm
Right.
talking about,
I got you.
now Freddie's very innovative. Don't get me wrong. When he was with Domino's, he brought them some of their first stuff, that they're
Yeah.
doing today.
Yeah.
But the point is, think about it this way. I'm going to take a field, and they look similar. I'm going to call it football and soccer. And I'm going to take a football player and put them on a soccer field and say, go play soccer. Or I'm going to take a soccer player and say, go play football. That's the number one reason that businesses fail, because they try to take an inventor, right, and put them in an entrepreneurial lane. The skill sets is similar to a football player trying to play soccer.
Yep. You got it.
It's very, very different.
Yep.
The reason that some inventors are very successful is because they have lightning in the bottle and they have pre-made people that want the product.
Yeah.
If their product is so good that it's like it just is an automatic win,
Dr. Cade.
Correct.
You know?
Bingo. But he wasn't an entrepreneur, was he?
No. But
Not
he
at all.
created it, and it grew from there.
And it grew from there. But it took a company to take it over to get it into the market.
Have you ever studied Dan Gilbert? Dan Gilbert owns Rocket Mortgage.
Okay.
Okay. He has purchased and bought, I will use the term, almost every large skyscraper in Detroit.
Okay.
And over the last 15, 20 years, he's renovated them, and he does the same thing. And
Right.
my daughter used to work for one of those companies. He will put you, he has startups in these high skyscrapers.
Yeah, right.
But you're only able to stay there so long.
Right.
Once your business grows to this point, you've got to go over here and rent space
Of
from
course,
me
yes,
over
yeah.
here in a larger
Right.
office space. But it's the same concept. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, the opportunities that you create for other people.
Yeah. Well, we're leveraging off what is being done in Gainesville at the University of Florida in the hub, being able to leverage off of what's being done at the Sid Barton and some other incubators. Certainly, we don't, there's attorney firms out at Tech City. There's all, people say, well, is Tech City only for tech? A brewery is not, well, in a twisted way, it is a tech company because
Yeah.
it's so technical to make it. But the point is bringing this very eclectic group. I mean, we've got 47 companies. Technically, we've just signed 3 more deals, so we're about to announce that we broke the 50 mark. But we've got people like NovaProach Spine, a brand new medical device company, FDA approval. It goes through the belly button. It's half the time, half the cost, half the recovery. Amazing, right? And he only has, I don't know, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 square feet. So these are not, but he's going to be, his company's worth a lot of money.
And we all
Well, the
remember-
devices are real
yeah.
little, so you can
Yeah.
actually store them in a room about this size. But the point is that there are a lot of companies coming. We just signed a deal with the international company that's coming. We have a lease on the table for a Fortune 100 pharmaceutical company.
Awesome.
And it's the fastest growing tech community in North Central Florida.
We have about a minute to go. So in about 30 seconds, just wrap up what your goal is with that project.
My goal is to empower people and their companies to be the greatest that they can be and have world-changing impacts. And a lot of those companies are ancillary, like a brewery, as an example, but they love it. The housing is ancillary. We're doing, one of the things about housing is on the affordable housing component. I'll say this really fast. If you live and work there, if your company will give you up to $200 a month off the rent, Rich and I will match that. So let's say rent's $1,800 a month. Now it's going to be $1,400 a month. So we're doing a partnership with the realtor organization to say this is a beta test to see how affordable housing can work if you bring people closer to their work and their home. All
Amazing.
kinds of ideas. And so I love that bubbling up. And so that's really my goal, is to make it as sustainable as possible and as impactful as possible.
It's been great. What an hour. Just went by like that.
Yeah.
He's Mitch Glaeser, Bob Ganzak, coming to you live from Spurrier's Gridiron Grill. This has been Motivation U, the podcast.